Bene, mi sembra che possiamo cominciare. Allora, benvenuti ad ascoltare qui Barry EICHENGREEN, uno dei più importanti storici dell'economia, un protagonista del dibattito economico mondiale. Io sono Stefano Lepri, editorialista economico della Stampa di Torino. Ecco, Barry EICHENGREEN oggi vi spiegherà che non è proprio vero che il mondo globalizzato sta diventando più piatto, come dice un famoso libro di una quindicina d'anni fa del famoso giornalista americano Thomas Friedman, oppure più piccolo, si sta raggrinzendo in una maniera particolare. Lui ha studiato come a proposito del mercato delle valute. Però prima vi devo dire chi è EICHENGREEN in generale. Purtroppo solo un suo libro è stato tradotto in italiano, un libro sulla la nascita dell'economia europea, la storia economica di Europa dal 1945 al 2000. I due suoi libri più importanti non lo sono. E invece se fate una ricerca su un sito italiano di libri trovate, e anche questo è interessante, trovate forse prima i libri di sua madre Lucille, una sopravvissuta di Auschwitz, che sono dei libri molto toccanti. I due libri più importanti che ha scritto Barry EICHENGREEN sono, anni fa, Golden Fetters sul gold standard della crisi monetaria degli anni 30. Il più recente, e vi dico a me è piaciuto molto, si chiama Hall of Mirrors ed è una storia comparata della crisi che abbiamo vissuto recentemente, che forse non è ancora finita, e della grande crisi degli anni 30. Barry EICHENGREEN è anche molto presente nel dibattito economico corrente, lo trovate su Project Syndicate, il sito internet dei principali commentatori mondiali. Lì c'è anche una traduzione in italiano per chi non sa l'inglese. Il suo ultimo articolo si chiama, è sul debito cinese, si chiama Affrontare la montagna del debito cinese, di un paio di settimane fa. Ma se invece l'inglese lo sapete, proprio perché siamo in Italia, in Europa, vi consiglio di leggere, lo trovate su internet, un articolo che ha scritto su Voxeu, il sito degli economisti europei, a proposito della crisi dell'euro. L'ha scritto insieme a un noto economista francese, Charles Viplos. E questo sito è una ironica, insieme informatissima, controstoria della crisi dell'euro, cioè come l'avremmo potuta risolvere in Europa molto meglio di come l'abbiamo risolta e con molti meno danni. Ecco, sì. Fra l'altro, per dirvelo solo in una parola, ecco, il whatever it takes di Draghi che salva l'euro, invece in questa controstoria l'ha pronunciato Jean-Claude Trichet un anno e mezzo prima. E le cose sono andate molto meglio perché la BCE è stata capace di decidere prima e soprattutto credo che in quel caso l'Italia si sarebbe risparmiata molte sofferenze. Ecco, l'argomento di oggi è invece il commercio delle valute internazionale. Credo che il professor EICHENGREEN farà anche riferimento, che insegna, dimenticavo di dire, che insegna a Berkeley in California. Forse vi citerà anche il nuovo libro di Michael Lewis, che chi ha visto ieri sera il bel film La grande scommessa, commentato dal professor Ronado, che è qui in sala. Ecco, quel film è tratto da un libro di Michael Lewis, un bravo giornalista economico americano, che poi ne ha scritto un altro che si chiama Flash Boys e che parla appunto di questi cavi in fibra ottica che vengono stesi per anticipare al massimo anche di millisecondi le operazioni, o nanosecondi, io non lo so nemmeno, le operazioni di borsa. Ecco. Oggi il professor EICHENGREEN vi spiegherà, ecco, io quando ho cominciato, ero molto giovane, a fare il giornalista economico, pensavamo che il mercato delle valute internazionale era dominato dagli gnomi di Zurigo. Si diceva gli gnomi perché in Svizzera ci dovrebbero essere gnomi, erano i banchieri di Zurigo ovviamente. Ora, una cosa che Barry EICHENGREEN vi dirà che invece gli gnomi di Zurigo non contano più tanto per alcuni fenomeni, a causa di alcuni fenomeni che lui ha studiato, per cui invece c'è Singapore che è diventata molto più importante di Zurigo, ci sono altre strane modificazioni nel commercio internazionale delle valute che veramente vale la pena di capire, proprio perché il commercio internazionale delle valute assorbe una così grande quantità di risorse, è una cosa così importante nei mercati di oggi. Fra l'altro una domanda che io mi sono posto rispetto alla sua esposizione, se Londra esce visto che Londra è uno dei centri più importanti, che cosa succede se Londra non sarà più nella comunità europea, se qui ci sarà qualche influenza. Comunque, ascoltiamo che cosa dirci Barry EICHENGREEN.
Stefano, thank you for the kind introduction. I think you covered most of the important points of the paper. Already we can move directly to the Q&A, but you neglected to mention one thing, which is, for how long should I talk? How long does this session go?
Up to
45 minutes? Okay, very good. This paper is a little bit different from the research that I've done in the past, and I will come back to why momentarily. It is a collaboration with a couple of economists at the European Central Bank. It has another title, which may have been part of what lured you all in here this afternoon: Cables, Sharks, and Servers, depicted respectively left, center, and right, and I'll describe their relevance to the geography of the foreign exchange market momentarily. But I chose this paper for this afternoon because I think it does relate to the theme of the festival this year, which has to do with the geography or the location of economic growth, economic activity, and in my case, service sector activity in particular. The point of departure is the familiar observation that we are living through a technological revolution. The cost of everything related to information and communications technology is falling like a stone, and the implications of that for our lives, for the economy, for the location of economic activity. Our question this long weekend is quite unclear, and that pertains in particular to what is now the most important part of our economy, the service sector, which accounts for, depending on the advanced economy one is concerned with, 50, 60, 70, 80% of employment. So I don't know what that number would be for Italy, but I conjecture it would be something on the order of 70% of employment in Italy is on the service sector. So whether information and communications technology will favor service sector employment in Italy or disfavor it is potentially a first order question. As with all interesting questions, economic, there are different points of view, different hypotheses, different conjectures. So one view is that cheap information technology will significantly reduce the importance or the effect of distance on the location of economic activity. Other factors and not the costs of communicating across distance will determine where activity occurs. So there are some kinds of economic activities like what we in California do in Silicon Valley, where agglomeration economies are very important, where activity will concentrate in a few major centers like Silicon Valley, and then because distance is very unimportant for distribution, whatever is being the knowledge and other things that are being produced in those few centers will be distributed worldwide. Then there are other activities where agglomeration effects are unimportant. I was pondering this afternoon what an illustration of that might be. Call centers, I suppose, would be an example where it's not important for everyone who answers the telephone when you call your airline to be located in the same place. Instead, cheap and efficient information technology may allow those activities, which were previously concentrated in a few places, to be dispersed across space and undertaken where the cost of the relevant inputs is least. So the airline that I fly has recently disbanded its call sectors and given its employees computers that they can work with sitting in their bathrobes at home. So whenever I call my airline to rebook my ticket, I get someone in a different U.S. city, depending on the relevant time zone and the relative cost of labor, and so forth. A change in the location of economic activity that has been very much driven by advances in information technology. So either way you cut it, in both of these cases, which are rather different in their implications, the first one implies that a lot of the high-value economic activity will be concentrated in a few places. The other one implies that activity will be dispersed widely across space. Distance is no longer the cost of distribution of the service of knowledge or whatever is no longer the binding constraint. There is, at the same time, another view, which is that all this talk about a flat world, Thomas Friedman's phrase, is exaggerated, and that distance still matters importantly for economic activity. There are a variety of activities, a variety of service sectors in which local activity and jobs are still protected or still shielded by some combination of political, cultural, linguistic, and regulatory frictions that even cheap, very cheap, information and communications technology cannot erase, that local knowledge still matters for local production. Physical proximity is still important for coordinating different stages of the production process, for coordinating related activities, and that limits the scope for outsourcing activities to far distant locations where the cost of the relevant inputs is less. If you look at the empirical literature in international economics, we don't have a lot of empirical regularities that are robust and that really stand up to different empirical techniques and different data sets. But one that does really stand up is the importance of distance for trade. Two economies that are close to one another trade a lot more bilaterally than do economies that are far distant, and distance still appears to matter empirically for the location of production of a variety of different kinds of goods. Helen Ray and Richard Portis, two economists in London, argue that it similarly still matters importantly for the location of financial service production, financial intermediation. So what my co-authors and I do in this research project is use the foreign exchange market as a case study with which to test these competing views. Why is this an appealing case? Number one, it's one of the largest markets, period. One of the largest financial markets, service sectors in the world. It is purely immaterial. It's a service sector in which services, matching buyers and sellers of foreign exchange, and not the production of physical merchandise, takes place. It's been fundamentally transformed since the late 1980s by information and communications technology, as I will describe to you. And usefully for my purposes, because I'm an economist and I've been trained to worry about identification and exogeneity, it can be argued, I will argue, that the transformation in information and communications technology affecting this market occurred for reasons unrelated to financial services, for reflecting very different considerations, imperatives that were essentially exogenous to the foreign exchange market. So here is Mr. Friedman's, the New York Times columnist's view. We called the first hypothesis that location, distance, and other aspects of geography no longer matter, or they no longer matter as much in a a global foreign exchange market where currencies can be traded 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as they did before. After Friedman, we called this the flat world hypothesis, the argument being that in a world of high-speed communication, sales and purchases of foreign exchange can take place anywhere, and we should expect to observe those transactions in a growing number of different locations, reflecting the availability of local knowledge about what the Banca d'Italia is doing. Foreign exchange will be traded in Italy. People who worry about what the Fed is doing will want to trade in New York, so forth and so on. And because of cheap information and communications technology, you can find, if you're a buyer, you can find a matching seller easily enough wherever you're located, courtesy of cheap communications. The other view, the movie that some people saw yesterday was The Big Short, yes, which was Michael Lewis's previous book. Subsequent to that, he wrote, our neighbor Michael Lewis, who lives up the street from us in Berkeley, wrote a book about information and communications technology as well, in which he argued that co-location, being close to where the electronic platforms on which foreign exchange is traded, was critically important. If you could respond to a buy order more quickly than your competitor, you could get a slightly better price. And if you were hooked up to a high-speed cable and co-located only a few feet away, ideally in the same building as the matching servers of Thomson Reuters in Trenton, New Jersey. Trenton is named after. Yeah. So if you were closely nearby where the electronic platforms were located, you had an advantage, and there was therefore an incentive for transactions to concentrate in a few places in Greater New York, in London, and in Tokyo, where Thomson Reuters and electronic brokerage services, the two big electronic traders, locate their computers. You want it to be there, or you want it to have a direct cable link to them. Very different implication of what the foreign exchange market would look like in the 21st century. This view would say it will tend to be flashy rather than flat. It will tend to be concentrated in a very few specific locations. So that's the question we ask in this paper. Has cheap information and communications technology led to a greater concentration of sales and purchases of foreign exchange in that small handful of financial centers? Or has it enhanced the competitiveness of suppliers of these services in a bunch of other places? You can buy and sell foreign exchange more conveniently in Milan using local knowledge about the Italian market, but you can communicate easily with London because Italy is now connected by high-speed IT to the relevant financial center, which in your case, until after Brexit, would be London. So that's that's the question we ask here. Has the market grown flatter or flashier? These kind of questions are not straightforward for economists to answer because in the real world, everything depends on everything else. Everything is endogenous, and we have an identification problem in this context as well as others. The state of technology can affect where economic activity takes place. That's the causal connection that I am interested in here. But conversely, but at the same time, changes in where economic activity takes place can also prompt changes in investments in technology. The technology will depend on the geography of economic activity as well as the other way around. Identification is rendered even more difficult because in the real world, most things move slowly together at the same time, and that makes it even harder to figure out what is causing what. Instances where there are sharp changes in technology for reasons unrelated to the relevant economic activity that affects different market participants at different points in time. I've just described to you kind of the ideal natural experiment where it would be possible to identify the effect of technology, though that kind of natural experiment is not very common. So the argument here is that in the foreign exchange market, indeed, we have just such a source of exogenous change in technology, and indeed spatial variability. Different national markets were affected at very different points in time for reasons unrelated to financial services. And those exogenous changes were the laying of subsurface, submarine, meaning, on the ocean floor, fiber-optic cables, starting in the late 1980s. Cables not laid for purposes related to electronic foreign exchange trading. Rather, they were laid by telephone companies. They were laid by telecom companies for purposes of capturing telephone calls that students studying abroad would make to their parents back at home, or for a variety of other purposes. Eventually, over time, with a considerable lag, the utility of those cables for electronic trading of foreign exchange was discovered, but only slowly over time. And only slowly over time was that global network of submarine fiber optic cables, what we now think of as the internet backbone, was that built out globally. So here is the internet backbone. These are the cables that I will analyze in the paper, starting with the cables that go across the North Atlantic, which are highly visible, right, in this figure that comes from a source called telegeography, from which are data on when different cable links went into service. One of the things I will point out momentarily is that this cable network, which dates from a couple of years ago, looks virtually identical to what the cable telegraphic network would have looked like 120 years ago. And I will argue that that's no coincidence either, which is a further fact that is helpful for identifying what is exogenous and what is endogenous. So I fear that this figure is not terribly visible for the people way up at the top of the room, but it starts in the late 1980s on the horizontal axis and extends basically up to today. And it has a variety of different countries indicated along the vertical axis. And the little circle is the first year in which the country in question was connected to London or New York or Tokyo. And you can see that there is a lot of variability over time. France gets hooked up to London at the beginning, other countries, Iceland, for reasons relevant to my story, it's a very hard place to land a cable because of the shoreline geography, gets hooked up to London and New York only in 2004. Here are the gnomes of Zurich. Now, the gnomes of Zurich used to be as important in the foreign exchange market almost as the gnomes of Singapore. What would the analogous phrase be? Back in 1995 they were, but come 2013, Singapore is more than twice as important in terms of foreign exchange market turnover as Zurich, an incredibly important foreign exchange trading center historically. Why this difference? Well, Singapore has sandy, it's an island basically. It has sandy shorelines. If you've been scuba diving there, you know that the shorelines kind of rise gradually to the shore. It's a very easy place to land, to hook up the submarine cable to the land-based telecom network. And Singapore, maybe if we go back a couple of slides, you can see a cluster of points down there. That's Singapore, where the big cluster, because it's a logical hub for submarine fiber optic cables. Just now, Zurich is getting a cable. They had to dig at incredible expense at trench, basically from Zurich to Frankfurt, which hooks them up to the global network, but that was expensive and that took time. And here you see the time series for Zurich and Singapore. They moved together for a long time. Then comes the cable network to Singapore. Then comes the growth of electronic trading, and all of a sudden Singapore is twice as important as Zurich as a foreign exchange trading center. So as I've said, our empirical strategy relies on the cable network, and it relies on the fact that people who want to trade foreign exchange at the best possible price also want to do that in London or Tokyo or New York, where the matching servers, the electronic platforms that concentrate a bunch of transactions, buy and sell transactions, are located. So that's what we basically look at. Do you have a cable connection to London, Tokyo, or New York? If you have one, for how long have you had it? With what impact on the geography? So you might think, I think a lot of people's intuition, my intuition immediately went, this ought to lead all the business to migrate to London, New York, and Tokyo. That turns out not exactly to be the case. There are two offsetting effects, both operating in this domain. So the first one is the direct effect of the cable. If there's a cable connection running from Milan to London, the direct effect of that is actually to encourage trading in Milan, because foreign exchange trade providers, the bank that you would go to if you wanted to do a foreign exchange trade in Milan or some other Italian city, can use its local information about what's going to happen to Italian interest rates or whatever, and then it can book the trade for you at a very low price in London using its cable connection. But the way people think about where the money is made by the service providers, it's made by the desk at which the sale takes place, where you go into the bank in Milan and you say, I want to sell euros and buy dollars. The direct effect of a cable is to increase the share of currency trades occurring onshore, in my example, in Milan. But there's also an indirect effect, which it reflects the fact that there are other frictions that tend to segment markets. If you are far distant from London, New York, or Tokyo, if you're in a bad time zone, like New Zealand or India, a lot of your foreign exchange trading occurs onshore, because if you wanted to trade in Tokyo or London, they would be sleeping when you were awake, and vice versa. Distance is a cost. It's inconvenient from the point of view of this market. If your local financial market is very liquid, it'll be cheap and convenient to trade locally rather than offshore. Conversely, if the local market is narrow and illiquid, you would rather trade in London. And if there are capital controls, that might keep you onshore rather than going off. The indirect effect of a cable connection is to erode the effect of those frictions. So again, the direct effect makes it cheaper to trade locally. The indirect effect means that anything that was keeping business onshore previously, like the inconvenience of distance and being in the wrong time zone, matters less when you have a cable connection. And yeah, it turns out in the end that the second indirect effect dominates, and on balance we do see that the world grows flashier and that there is more concentration of foreign exchange trading in the major centers, although that effect is not universally seen. So I've told you a little bit. I guess I can be relatively brief here. I've told you what we need to know about electronic broking before these electronic platforms, if you wanted to trade foreign exchange, you would ask your bank to place a trade for you, and your bank specialist would get on the telephone and call a larger specialist who would be aggregating these calls over something called a squawk box. So they would have a speakerphone on their desk, and a bunch of people would say, I want to buy euros at 103, no, 103.5, whatever, and eventually a transaction would take place with electronic platforms, with computer systems. All of that became much more efficient. But this migration to electronic transactions took time. In particular, it was necessary to link up other banks in other financial centers to those electronic platforms and to build out the submarine fiber-optic cable network. So let me tell you a little more about these cables. They go back more than 150 years, so if you remember Morse code, you remember Samuel Morse, who was the pioneer in laying a submarine cable. He established that you could lay a copper cable underwater in New York Harbor in 1842, and if you insulated it adequately from the water, he used tarred hemp that had been dipped in tar. He could transmit Morse code signals telegraphically, and then they replaced tarred hemp with gutta percha, the gum from Malaysian gutta percha trees, virtually all of which were cut down in order to obtain the gum to lay the global telegraph network over the subsequent half century. So we were in London in the UK for a year, and I had the opportunity to visit the City Museum of London, where you can see a piece of the original cable that this one that ran from Great Britain to the European continent in the 1850s. The first transatlantic cable was completed in 1858. It didn't work, never worked very well. It took 6.5 hours to transmit a one-paragraph message from Queen Victoria to President Buchanan. The cable failed completely after 6 weeks because of the currents that were dislodging it from its location on the ocean floor. The trick was to lay the cable deep enough that it wouldn't be interfered with by icebergs, but shallow enough that the equipment of the time could actually carry the cable to the mid-Atlantic. They succeeded for the first time in 1858. They celebrated in New York with a fireworks display that burned down City Hall in New York. Finally, in 1866, here's an illustration of the technology they needed to carry this thick, vast amounts of thick cable out to the mid-Atlantic. Copper cable surrounded by rubber, or gutta percha surrounded by an outer layer of iron. The problem being that these cables were not very efficient, not very reliable. The signal would dissipate with distance, so it had to be transmitted at a very high voltage in the absence of an amplifier along the way. That created distortion, that limited carrying capacity, that heightened the risk of short circuiting. Technology marches on, so you got repeater amplifiers, devices that could be installed along the cable. You got advances in knowledge about long-distance telephonic communication and transmitting at higher frequencies, but it took until after World War II for that new technology to actually be implemented because of the disruptions of World Wars I and II and the Great Depression, when not very much investment was done. Stage two is then coaxial cables. So if you're old enough to have a traditional stereo system, you will recall coaxial cables, solid copper, now insulated by polyurethane rather than gutta percha, using vacuum tubes to amplify the signal. The first one I illustrate here, laid between Scotland and Newfoundland in 1955, really a technological revolution at the time. So this cable was made famous because you could not only transmit Morse code, but you could hear Paul Robeson performing a concert to an audience sitting in New York because the U.S. authorities had seized his passport. Robeson having famously used his prominence to demonstrate for civil rights, but he could still, with the cable, perform to an audience sitting in St. Pancras Town Hall in London. So let's see if this works or not. Cable isn't working. What do you think? I'm looking for a YouTube video that is supposed to... All right. We have time. All right, so I'm going to come back to this once we have the technology. After coaxial cables, of course, come finally our fiber optic cables, where fiber optic means that data can be transmitted at the speed of light in glass, which means very, very fast. And the cable network, then the first submarine fiber optic cable is completed and enters into service at the end of 1988. So here again is my critical fact that it was an investment project of American Telegraph and Telephone Company, French Telecom, and British Telecom, which they invested in order to be able to compete with other telephone companies to transmit voice traffic. The problem being that this cable, not unlike its earlier predecessors, had reliability problems. The problem with fiber optics, transmitting all that electric signal through glass, is of course sharks. That sharks are, as you all know, are electrosensitive. They have little sensors in their mouths that sense electricity, which tells them food is nearby, and they go into feeding frenzies and they attack the cables. So in order to make these cables reliable, you have to sheath them in kevlar, you know, very, very, move it from the battlefield to the ocean floor. So there's another video here, which I'll come back to as well, as soon as the cabling is complete. Shark bites fiber optic cables undersea, so it won't be a surprise what this one is when we get to it. So come 10 years ago, 99% of international communications traffic was carried by these submarine cables. Everybody in this room has a cell phone, and you're used to talking to one another by satellite. The critical point being that that's a relatively recent development. For 5 and more years from for much of the first decade of the 20th century, cables were much more important than satellite for communicating even voice traffic. Now, voice has moved to satellite, and data is what we communicate by cable. So For those of us who follow the continuing development of the global submarine cable network, cables are now being invested in and built by Google and such companies. Google just completed one that runs from Florida to Brazil, and another one that runs from California, just a little bit north of where I live, to Tokyo, and from Tokyo to the rest of Asia. Okay, let's see if we can. This is the relevant one now, right? No? So we should be able to click on that. What do you? All right, so we'll make that the conclusion of the lecture then. Finally, in the last year, there have been cables laid for purposes expressly related to foreign exchange trading. So this one, Hibernia Express, in the dark blue line, you can see it is a more direct shot between London and New York. Traders can cut, 5 milliseconds off the time involved in a trade. But importantly, in the period that I'm analyzing, there were no cables laid for foreign exchange trading related purposes. We'll get them back. Okay, so if I go back, don't go anywhere. One moment. Let's see here. In control and you and I can. Was it worth waiting for? All right, so we get the point. Let me see if I can. What do you think I do here? All right. I will reward your patience. One more, and then we'll go on. So for this, we need audio as well.
This piece of metal at the bottom of the sea, it means the world.
Hello, Paul.
Hello? Hello?
Paul Robeson once travelled the globe, an international superstar performing to sell-out audiences across America and the world. Film, theatre, song or speech, Robeson made people want to listen. Now they can't. The US State Department have revoked his passport because his powerful voice is radically off message. He talks of lynchings, corporate greed, of segregation.
I find
And
this
in the
fascinating.
1950s,
It's a
at the height of
fiber-optic cable for a
McCarthyism,
stereo.
his left-wing views are enough to have
If I
him
shine this
branded
laser pointer down
communist,
the cable,
un-American,
the light
threat to
feather
the
in.
nation. And they don't just bar him from
These
leaving the
cables are
country,
used to connect
they
our
bar
world
him from
today and are
performing in
capable of
public.
transmitting information
Anyway.
across countries and oceans.
But
The
they
first
haven't
one, let me show you how it works.
Robeson's unlikely ally.
I have a bucket
The
that I
new
modified with a
technology
window
that
in
will
front,
set him
Audio is on.
and on the other
I think
telltale cable.
this is above my pay grade, clearly. So again, you get the point. There is a YouTube video that can be consulted later. And professors say we will leave that part for a homework assignment. All right, so there is actually empirical work in this paper, so let me describe that briefly. What we do is we combine data on the submarine fiber optic cable network with data on the location of foreign exchange trading, which is gathered every 3 years by the Bank for International Settlements. So they gather data for 55 different currencies, and for each currency they ask people who trade that currency, do you trade that currency locally or do you trade it offshore? And we have those data for 7 years, every 3 years, starting in 1995. So you can look and see how the share of foreign exchange trades that is occurring offshore, in other words, in a location other than the country issuing that currency, has been changing over time, and the answer is it's been going up. Reassuringly, for me, it's above 50%. So there are two currencies involved in every foreign exchange transaction, and by definition, one of them is being traded outside the country of issuance in each case. So the share starts out at about what, 73%, and has gone up now to closer to 76, 77, 78%. Maybe information technology is making the market flashier. And here you see the share of foreign exchange trades that occur in Tokyo, in London at the bottom, in New York in the middle, and in Tokyo at the top. So Brexit really is an issue not only for London, but for the world. That's another hint that maybe the market is growing flashier. Here you can see that there is a lot of heterogeneity, big differences among currencies in terms of whether they are traded onshore or offshore. So the Korean won is mainly traded and sold. The Polish zloty and the euro are mainly traded in Poland and in Eurozone, and a lot of other currencies are arrayed in between. So an economist would be interested in understanding why we see that heterogeneity. Most currencies in this 55 currency sample are traded heavily offshore. Our hypothesis then, as I said before, is that a cable connection reduces the impact of other financial and policy frictions that may have segmented the global foreign exchange market in the past. It may also enhance the attractions of transacting in a location that is separate from one of those centers, but now possesses a high-speed cable connection to it, and which one of the countervailing effects dominates is not clear a priori. So we might think that our customer in Milan would now contact a sales desk in London and ask the sales desk in London to book her foreign exchange trade. But communicating between Milan and London is more complicated than communicating between Milan and Rome. Different time zones, different languages, all that. So maybe the services provided by the sales desk in Milan could become more competitive rather than less as a result of Milan having a high-speed connection to clear the transaction that it sold to a local customer. Formally, we model the share of each of the 55 currencies traded offshore as a function of three frictions. Distance, where the relevant measure of distance here, it turns out, is time zone difference. Distance, the example I described to you before. We also look at physical distance and some other alternatives, but it's really time zones that seem to matter for foreign exchange traders. Whether the local financial market is liquid or illiquid, whether there are capital controls limiting the ability of residents to transact offshore or not, whether there is a cable connection either directly or indirectly from country A, Korea, to either Tokyo, London, or New York, and we look both at direct cable connections and indirect ones up through 8 other countries up to the 9th order. Finally, we interact whether there's a cable connection or not with these financial frictions. So very quickly, let me say a couple of other things about the exogeneity assumption, that the cable is exogenous in this context. As I've already hinted in a heavy-handed way, the geography of the cable network is heavily influenced by seabed topography. It's also heavily influenced by earlier telegraph and coaxial networks. They figured out in the 19th and early 20th century where the currents were favorable to laying a cable and it remaining in operation for an extended period. And that's where they put the fiber optic cables a century later. They figured out where the convenient landing points were back in the days of coaxial and copper cables. That's where they put the landing points in the main for fiber optic cables. So on the left is the British Eastern Telegraph system. On the right is the modern submarine fiber optic cable system. They, of course, look identical almost to one another. And there are some illustrations here that I will skip in the interest of time of these topographical considerations. Iceland was connected to the UK finally only in 2004 because there are not very many convenient landing points for a cable on that island. We're interested in understanding the share of foreign exchange trades in a currency that occur offshore. They depend on information asymmetries, which means how far away time zone-wise are you from one of these centers. They depend on whether you have a liquid domestic financial market, and they depend on whether you, South Korea, have capital controls or not. We include whether you have a cable connection, as described before, and we interact, look at the shorter of the 2 arrows here, whether you have a cable connection or not with the 3 financial frictions. And we include, as economists are trained to do, a variety of other control variables like how open to trade, how open financially you are, what your exchange rate regime is, what your interest differential vis-a-vis London is, et cetera, et cetera. So what are the key findings? The key findings are if you have a cable, the share of your currency that is traded offshore goes down. The coefficient on the cable variable is negative. That's the direct effect that I described to you before, that having a cable connection actually enhances the competitiveness of the local sales desk in Milan vis-a-vis London, New York, and Tokyo, because the local sales desk in Milan speaks Italian. It has local knowledge valuable to the Italian customer. It can provide the service, get the commission, and then clear the transaction using the cable and the electronic platform in London. Here are the interactive effects, and they're all positive. They're all opposite in sign to the direct effects up above in the same column. So where it says time zone difference, you have a negative coefficient. If you're in a bad time zone, you trade mainly locally, a smaller share offshore, but interacted with the cable variable offsets that friction. And the interaction terms for domestic market liquidity and capital controls are similarly offsetting. So maybe here I will skip relatively quickly and conclude. What I'm showing you here is how having a cable influences the impact of time zone difference on whether a currency is traded onshore or offshore. So if you're in the same time zone as New York, if you're Canada, if you're Toronto, Your currency is traded mainly in New York. It's convenient to transact in the big center because the time zone is the same. You're awake at the same time as those guys in New York. The dotted line toward the very left of the figure is time zone difference equals 0. Currency is mainly traded, very high share of the currency is traded offshore. And then that line declines over time as you move 1, 2, 3, 4 time zones away from one of those big centers. More of the trading is cooped up at home. The solid line is the effect when you have a cable. When you have a cable, you trade more onshore because of that convenience factor I described to you before, but the effect of distance is then attenuated. The slope of this relationship is much less in the case of the solid line than in the case of the dotted one. And you can tell similar stories for, and which effect dominates on balance. If you're in the same time zone as one of the main centers, if you're Canada, the main thing that having a cable connection does is to bring some of that business back onshore. But if you're New Zealand and you're far distant from Tokyo or London or New York, if you're on the right-hand side of this figure, the main thing that having a cable connection does is to drive business offshore. One can tell the same kind of story for financial market liquidity. I will spare you. One can tell the same story for the effect of capital controls. Finally, this is the last point. You can conduct kind of a counterfactual exercise and compare the share of foreign exchange trades that this model predicts will occur offshore if you have a cable versus if you don't have a cable. Shares offshore are generally higher if you have a cable. The indirect effects dominate the direct ones, and we see this most dramatically to the left of this figure in cases like the New Zealand dollar and the Indian rupee, where countries that are in very bad time zones, where badness is measured in terms of proximity to London, New York, etc. The Canadian dollar and the Korean won are the contrasting cases where they are in the same time zone as New York, or they are in the same time zone as Tokyo. So the main effect is to advantage the local sales desk. The share offshore, therefore, declines with a cable connection. Those are the cases way to the right of the figure. So that's what we find. We find that cable connections make it more convenient to trade currencies locally, and they enhance the competitiveness of the local sales desk. Other things equal, they lead to a flatter financial world, if you will. But they also attenuate other frictions like time zone distance, local market illiquidity, the restrictive capital controls and regulation that would otherwise prevent transactions from moving offshore to the major financial centers. And our estimates suggest that on balance, the second effect dominates the first, and that this sector in particular is becoming flashier, more concentrated, rather than flatter as a result of the impact of information technology. So thank you for your attention.
Così abbiamo visto come con un metodo di indagine scientifico si può arrivare a conclusioni sorprendenti e per la gran parte controintuitive. Ecco, vediamo se qualcuno ha da fare delle domande.
Sir, thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering if you can say something about the concentration point you just made. What does that mean for that market in terms of stability of the market? Thank you.
It really means that we all depend more on the efficiency and prudence of regulation of that small number of large foreign exchange markets. So I think that in fact is part of the debate over the implications of Brexit for the City of London and the geography of financial services, that the European Central Bank may be reluctant to provide euro-denominated credit in large amounts to big financial players in a country outside the European Union. So one implication is that that could make euro-denominated transactions in London more of a potential source of financial instability, of crisis, and it may create an incentive for regulators, EU regulators, to try to move that market back into the EU. But the more general answer to your question is that our fate will be tied even more strongly financially to the wisdom of regulation in that small handful of major financial centers.
Hello. Hello. I would like to ask you something about one of your books, not one that he cited. In one of your books, you talk about the exorbitant privilege of the dollar being the very first reserve currency. Right now in Europe, we are talking a lot about breaking up, leaving, and so on. Don't you think that despite the free trade, despite the common currency, there is an underratement of the dividend that the euro is giving to the Eurozone in being the second reserve currency of the world? Thank you.
So thank you for the plug for my book, Exorbitant Privilege. The argument there was that yes, there are benefits for to an issuer, to an economy, to be able to issue a currency that is widely used globally, that's widely used internationally. The United States can borrow internationally more cheaply as a result of the fact that every central banks around the world want our dollars than we could otherwise. More importantly, in my view, the United States also enjoys an automatic insurance policy that whenever a bad thing happens financially, the dollar actually strengthens and our financial markets are stabilized. So in September of 2008, a bad thing happened financially. Lehman Brothers failed. We in the United States caused the bad thing to happen, yet we benefited from the automatic insurance that everybody rushed into dollars, because the dollar was the safe and liquid asset that everyone used as a benchmark and central banks held as reserves around the world. If the euro was a comparably important international and reserve currency, the Eurozone would derive similar benefits to that. The other aspect of the answer is that I think the world would benefit from the euro being equally important international and reserve currency to the dollar. That there is a tension between having a multipolar global economy and a dollar-dominated monetary and financial system. The United States is not going to be able to provide safe and liquid assets to the entire world all by itself indefinitely. That there's a logic to economic convergence. This is our economic growth and geography theme. Again, emerging markets will eventually get their act together. There's reason that they should grow more quickly than the United States. The U.S. will account for a shrinking share of the global economy over time. We simply won't have the capacity to provide safe and liquid assets to the entire world all by ourselves indefinitely, and that's why other big economies where there are really only two candidates, the Eurozone and China, will have to, their currencies will have to become consequential globally as well. From that point of view, yes, I think people underestimate the advantages of the euro.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for an excellent lecture. I would like to take a different view on the question, even though I like this discussion a lot also. My question was based on, you showed us the history of the infrastructure or the cables, and I was thinking if you could comment more on the investment. I mean, these were all more or less made, these cross-Atlantic cables, before the telecom companies were privatized, if I remember years approximately the same. So do you see any, or did you look at the differences between when you make these investments now, when fiber optics in more private setting, compared to when the original cable investments were made more from a state-backed backing? Thank you.
Right, so quite a number of the early fiber optic cables were co-financed by state-owned or operated telecom companies. Again, I think even in those cases, the motivation, which is what's important for my argument, was to provide a vehicle for telephonic communication for the public more broadly, and not to enable financial markets, not to advantage local financial markets or something like that. But I would agree with you that it's a good idea for us to look a little bit more closely at that than we have.
Beh, se non c'è nessun'altra domanda possiamo ringraziare Barry EICHENGREEN e sperare che venga a Trento anche una terza volta, visto che questa è la seconda, se non sbaglio. The second time you came here.
And I think you shared the session I did at this festival 3 years ago.
Yes.